Welcome to the sixth episode of The Open Ground, Democracy and Tyranny, the perpetual forging of democratic capacity within economic tyranny. This is the first video in our politics playlist. As always, we will begin with a meta-reflection. Why this analysis? Why now? Democracy, as it is currently understood and practiced, is collapsing in plain sight, not through violent coup or constitutional suspension, but through the slow suffocation administered by economic domination. Its institutions remain intact. The rituals proceed undisturbed. Elections are held, votes are tallied, leaders are chosen. Yet the people somehow remain unheard. This essay emerges from that dissonance, the growing disjunction between the performance of democracy and the lived reality of political impotence. We are asked to believe that democracy endures because the process survives, even as its substance rots beneath the surface. The moment demands clarity, but not the clarity of punditry or surface analysis. It demands structural clarity, an excavation of the foundational assumptions that have allowed us to accept that democracy can persist while the vast majority live under conditions that render meaningful political participation structurally impossible. To say that democracy is failing is not enough. We must identify what has supplanted it, and by what means. The answer, increasingly inescapable, is economic tyranny. This tyranny does not wear the uniform of dictatorship, nor does it parade through the streets with tanks and banners. Its instruments are debt, wage servitude, precarity, privatization, algorithmic nudging, and scarcity-made policy. It is a tyranny whose genius lies in its invisibility, so embedded within the fabric of daily life that resistance feels both irrational and futile. And yet the demand for democracy persists. The question, then, is no longer whether democracy exists, but whether it can ever exist under such conditions. Perpetualism rejects the comfort of externalizing crisis. The failure is not elsewhere. It is not merely in the rise of authoritarian leaders or the spread of misinformation. The failure is in the foundation, in the belief that political democracy can be disentangled from economic structure. Perpetualism insists that problems must be addressed from within the very conditions that produce them. Thus, if economic tyranny is the condition, then the only valid analysis of democracy is one that begins inside that condition and remains there, refusing to abstract or escape. This is a post-quantum political philosophy, not in the sense of invoking quantum physics, but in recognizing the collapse of discrete categories. The boundary between economic and political has collapsed under the weight of its own fiction. What remains is entangled: feedback loops of perception and deprivation, participation and control, resistance and absorption. The pursuit of democratic capacity, therefore, cannot proceed as though the political remains an autonomous realm. It must become a forging, a continuous act of creation under constraint, within systems designed to prevent precisely that creation. This is why this essay must be written now, not to mourn democracy, nor to defend its hallowed rituals, but to re-articulate it, to confront the structure that has displaced it, and to offer, not a blueprint, but a conceptual armament for those who would dare to practice democracy not as inherited form, but as perpetual act, against, within, and in spite of economic tyranny. We begin from there. The illusion of political democracy in economic tyranny. The performance of choice. What we call democracy today is too often little more than a theatrical production, ritualized, choreographed, and framed with the semblance of autonomy. Ballots are cast, debates are held, campaigns simulate ideological divergence, and yet, for all its pageantry, the stage remains unchanged. The economic actors behind the curtain, corporations, financiers, landlords, and legacy wealth, dictate the bounds of what can be said, done, or imagined. Political democracy, under such conditions, becomes not a system of self-rule, but a performance of consent. This performance depends on the illusion of meaningful choice. Electoral politics offers the voter a selection of options carefully pre-filtered through the sieve of capital approval. Candidates outside the spectrum of economic acceptability are marginalized as unelectable. Policy positions that threaten capital flow are dismissed as unrealistic. The voter is permitted to choose, but only within the bounds of an already determined economic reality. Thus, what appears as political freedom is a deeply constrained simulation, one in which the outcomes are foreclosed long before the act of voting occurs. The deeper truth is that choice, when removed from material capacity, is not freedom, it is a burden. To vote within a structure one cannot meaningfully affect is to participate in one's own disempowerment, and to be told that this is liberation. The performance is not just maintained for appearance, it is maintained to preserve the belief that participation is power, when in reality, participation has become a substitute for power. Democratic procedures versus democratic capacity. There is a critical distinction, often deliberately blurred, between democratic procedure and democratic capacity. The former refers to the formal processes, elections, term limits, separation of powers, freedom of the press. These are mechanisms. The latter, democratic capacity, refers to the substantive ability of people to govern themselves, to shape the conditions of their lives, to alter the structures that determine their futures. This is power. In a healthy society, procedures support capacity. But in our current condition, procedures often function as obfuscation. They persist even as capacity erodes. And the greater the erosion of real democratic capacity, the more fanatically the system clings to the performance of procedural legitimacy, as if to insist that rituals can substitute for reality. This is the sleight of hand. Political democracy is declared alive because its organs are still twitching, even as its spirit has long since been evacuated. Perpetualism demands we look not at the operation of the procedure, but at the condition of the governed. Can they shape their economic reality? Can they access health, education, housing, autonomy? Can they withhold consent in any meaningful way? If the answer is no, then the existence of procedures is not democracy. It is performance art masking structural disenfranchisement. The managed opposition. Nowhere is this more evident than in the spectacle of political opposition. In theory, a functioning democracy requires competing visions. In practice, opposition is not only tolerated, but cultivated, as long as it remains within economically permissible bounds. Political parties do not exist to challenge foundational economic structure. They exist to absorb dissent, to metabolize frustration, to simulate divergence while maintaining convergence on the core priority, economic stability for capital. This is not conspiracy, it is system logic. Parties that fundamentally threaten the economic base are rendered illegible or dangerous. The left becomes a moral posture, stripped of class analysis. The right becomes a nostalgia cult for markets and militarism. Both operate under the same constraint. Do not threaten the architecture of capital. Within these limits, they may quarrel, posture, and scandalize. Outside these limits, they cannot function. What results is a managed spectrum of opposition that permits rage, as long as it remains unthreatening. Protest becomes spectacle. Radicalism becomes fashion. And all the while, the economic tyranny that renders real democracy impossible remains untouched. Thus, opposition itself becomes a gear in the machine, a necessary function to relieve pressure without changing direction. Economic tyranny as the ground condition. Wage slavery as political disenfranchisement. To be economically dependent is to be politically neutralized. The worker bound to their wage for survival has no real agency in the governance of their life, let alone the state. The majority live not under the rule of law, but under the rule of necessity. And necessity is the most effective tyrant, unyielding, invisible, and internalized. Wage labor, in its current form, is not merely an economic relationship, it is a political structure. It renders the individual beholden to institutions they do not control, producing for outcomes they do not direct, under conditions they cannot escape. The laborer's time, energy, and thought are extracted in exchange for the bare means to survive. This is not democracy, it is extraction in democratic dress. The freedom to vote becomes hollow when one cannot afford the time to engage, the resources to understand, or the security to resist. The freedom to speak collapses under the employer's gaze, the landlord's threat, the algorithm's surveillance. One cannot meaningfully participate in the governance of society while simultaneously scrambling to survive it. Wage slavery thus becomes a form of civic erasure, where the individual remains counted but never heard. Debt enclosure as civic paralysis. Debt is the weaponization of future time. It reaches forward, shackling potential and enclosing possibility. The indebted cannot organize, cannot strike, cannot rest, cannot dream, because their future has already been collateralized. Under this condition, democracy becomes a theater of postponed participation. One cannot afford to act politically until one has first secured the right to breathe. This is not incidental. Debt is policy. It is not the result of individual failure, but the structural design of a system that ensures political docility through economic entrapment. From student loans to medical bills, from predatory credit to mortgage servitude, debt disorients the individual, pulling their attention away from collective power toward isolated survival. And this paralysis is contagious. The indebted citizen loses not only the ability to act, but the belief that action is even possible. Politics becomes spectacle, an abstraction belonging to others. The result is a civic landscape of exhausted observers, each weighed down by invisible shackles, watching a democracy that no longer includes them, if it ever did. Manufactured scarcity as democratic nullification. There is no shortage of resources, only a shortage of access. Scarcity is manufactured, not by nature, but by economic design. Housing sits empty while people sleep in the streets. Food is wasted while children go hungry. Time is hoarded by the few while the many are run ragged. This artificial scarcity serves one function: control. Scarcity creates dependency, and dependency suppresses dissent. The population is kept in a perpetual state of competition for basic needs, which renders solidarity costly and resistance dangerous. When your survival depends on remaining acceptable to systems of power, your capacity to oppose those systems vanishes. Manufactured scarcity is not simply inefficient, it is tyrannical. It eliminates the material conditions necessary for democratic action. Moreover, scarcity restructures the imagination. It becomes difficult to envision alternatives when the present is shaped by lack. The horizon of possibility contracts, the idea of collective ownership, cooperative labor, or public luxury, is dismissed as fantasy, not because it is impractical, but because it threatens the scaffolding of control. In this context, economic tyranny is not a deviation from democracy. It is its precondition under current conditions. The economy is not neutral terrain on which democracy operates. It is the terrain. And when that terrain is structured to extract, enclose, and suppress, no amount of procedural decorum can redeem the system. The historical symbiosis: economic structure determines political possibility. Democracy has never existed in a vacuum. It is not an autonomous ideal floating above material conditions. It is a contingent emergence. Where democracy has flourished, even momentarily, it has done so not because of political virtue alone, but because of radical economic restructuring. Conversely, wherever economic concentration has calcified, political democracy has withered or ossified into performance. History does not merely suggest this link, it insists upon it. Athens. Democracy required economic reforms. The Athenian experiment in direct democracy did not arise from abstract deliberation alone. It was born through economic rupture. Solon's reforms in the 6th century BCE, including debt cancellation and land redistribution, were not moral gestures. They were preconditions for democratic possibility. Prior to these reforms, the citizenry was fractured. Many Athenians had fallen into debt bondage, sold into slavery, or stripped of land, rendering the demos incapable of governing because they had been materially nullified. It was only through dismantling this economic tyranny that the foundation for participatory politics could emerge. The reforms preceded the democratic form. They were not an outcome of it. This historical inversion matters. Democracy follows material liberation. It does not lead it. Moreover, Athenian democracy was never extended to all. It was structurally limited to citizens, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners. Even its most celebrated iteration rested upon the labor of the unfree. Yet even within that exclusionary frame, we see the principle. Political democracy requires economic restructuring. Where that restructuring is reversed, as it was during the Peloponnesian War and the oligarchic revolts, democracy collapses into elite rule. America. Political revolution required economic sovereignty. The American Revolution is often mythologized as a triumph of political ideals. But its engine was economic sovereignty. The rejection of British colonial rule was inseparable from the colonists' desire to control trade, land, and labor. No taxation without representation was not merely a demand for voice, it was a revolt against economic extraction by a distant elite. More tellingly, the Constitution itself was forged in response to economic instability. The Articles of Confederation had failed to guarantee property rights or suppress debtor uprisings like Shays' Rebellion. The Federalist Project was not simply about governance, it was about securing the conditions for capital accumulation. Even the vaunted Bill of Rights, while expanding formal liberties, left intact the economic structures of slavery, land dispossession, and industrial exploitation. The franchise expanded slowly, and always in tandem with economic interests. Where enfranchisement threatened wealth, it was delayed or denied. Democracy, once again, followed economic interest. It never transcended it. The New Deal, economic restructuring as prerequisite for democratic preservation. In the 1930s, as capitalism teetered and fascism surged globally, the U.S. faced a choice: preserve economic orthodoxy and risk collapse, or restructure in order to preserve political legitimacy. The New Deal was not socialism, it was a strategic concession, a partial redistribution of wealth and power designed to stabilize a political system at risk of implosion. Through labor protections, public employment, social security, and financial regulation, the Roosevelt administration expanded democratic capacity. These were not merely welfare measures, they were democracy-building measures. They gave people the material footing to participate politically, organize collectively, and imagine alternatives. For a brief moment, democratic structure was buttressed by economic democratization. Importantly, these reforms were won not through benevolence but through pressure. Strikes, protests, and militant organizing forced the state to act. Democracy advanced only under the threat of rupture, and even then it remained incomplete, limited by race, gender, and geography. The New Deal was a beginning, not a resolution. Contemporary collapse. How wealth concentration produces democratic backsliding. Today, We live in the reversal of that moment. Economic inequality has reached levels that rival or surpass the Gilded Age. Corporate power dwarfs national governments. Billionaires operate as unelected sovereigns. And democratic institutions, once hailed as bulwarks against tyranny, now function as veils for oligarchy. Where wealth concentrates, power consolidates. Where power consolidates, democracy evaporates. Voting districts are gerrymandered. Information ecosystems are privatized. Labor is fragmented. Civic institutions are hollowed out. The result is not merely democratic decline, it is systemic de-democratization under the pretense of continuity. This is not historical anomaly, it is historical rhythm. Democracy, where it has ever existed, has done so only on the unstable ground of temporary economic decentralization. Once that ground is recaptured by capital, democracy recedes. The lesson is stark. Without structural economic transformation, political democracy is a lie told in the language of hope. And without political democracy, economic tyranny consolidates unchallenged. The two cannot be disentangled. History offers no examples to the contrary. The false binary, liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, both serve economic elites. The popular narrative tells us that the great ideological struggle of our time is between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. This framing is both comforting and catastrophically misleading. It implies that the threat to freedom comes from the concentration of state power, and that the antidote lies in the preservation of liberal institutions. But this analysis ignores the silent third term that governs both ends of the spectrum: capital. In practice, both liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes increasingly serve the same economic masters. The methods differ, the aesthetics vary, but the structural allegiance remains consistent: upward distribution, profit maximization, labor suppression, and the shielding of capital from democratic intervention. Liberal democracies offer the illusion of consent. Authoritarian regimes dispense with the illusion, but both construct systems in which wealth remains sacred and the economic order inviolable. The citizen's role is not to govern the economy, but to adapt to its dictates, through policy in the democratic case, through force in the authoritarian one. The result is convergence beneath the spectacle of opposition. This convergence is not accidental, it is adaptive. Capital has no ideological loyalty. It will operate through markets or mandates, elections or edicts, liberal tolerance or fascist command. Its only concern is its own replication, as long as a system, whatever its political veneer, ensures profitability, capital will flow toward it, reward it, and insulate it from challenge. That is not a theory, it is a pattern. The managed spectrum. Political discourse is not free, it is managed. What appears as a spectrum of debate is a corridor of permissible thought bounded by economic acceptability. Ideas that threaten property relations, wealth concentration, or corporate sovereignty are either caricatured or excluded. What remains is an endless performance of disagreement within a tightly controlled arena of consensus. This managed spectrum performs a crucial function. It converts systemic critique into partisan noise. Structural inequalities become campaign talking points. Class antagonism is rebranded as cultural grievance. Policy failure is blamed on partisan obstruction rather than economic design. And always, the underlying architecture of capital remains off limits, sheltered behind a wall of bipartisan silence. The Overton window, we are told, determines what is politically viable. But who builds the window frame? Who sets its dimensions? In truth, viability is a function of capital tolerance. That which threatens profit is deemed radical. That which preserves it is called moderate. The window is not floating in ideological space. It is bolted to the economic foundation. Performative opposition. Opposition, in a managed spectrum, is not a threat, it is a necessity. It sustains the illusion of choice. It gives voice to discontent without redirecting it. This is why opposition must remain performative. It must speak loudly but act safely. It must posture rebellion while ensuring continuity. It must exhaust the public, not empower it. We see this in media ecosystems that elevate spectacle over substance, in parties that critique economic inequality but accept donations from the architects of that inequality, in movements that are defanged through co-optation, aestheticization, or internal fracture. The function of opposition under economic tyranny is not to change direction. It is to preserve motion without a rival. This is the genius of late-stage democratic capitalism. It does not suppress dissent. It incorporates it. It does not ban radical critique. It brands it. In doing so, it transforms resistance into marketable identity and renders revolution a fashion statement. What remains is not opposition, but opposition's performance, detached from consequence, insulated from power. The binary between liberal democracy and authoritarianism conceals more than it reveals. It distracts us from the deeper dichotomy, democracy versus tyranny, where tyranny wears many masks, including the mask of liberty. The true line of struggle does not run between nations or ideologies, but between systems that democratize power and systems that centralize it, regardless of their political costumes. Civic faith, democratic practice under tyrannical conditions. Faith is democracy. When institutional guarantees erode, when economic structures disable self-governance, and when opposition becomes performance, what remains of democracy is not found in systems but in acts. Deliberate, continuous, often invisible acts. Under economic tyranny, democracy is not a condition one inhabits, it is a faith one enacts. But this is no naive belief in eventual triumph. It is not the optimism of historical arc or progressive inevitability. This is faith not as consolation, but as confrontation. It is the faith that refuses collapse, not because there is hope, but because collapse must be resisted regardless. To practice democracy under these conditions is to accept that participation may not be rewarded, that truth may not prevail, and that effort may not be visible. It is to affirm that democracy is done, not received. Such civic faith is not blind. It sees the structure clearly. It knows the economic forces aligned against it. It knows the futility of procedural appeals in rigged systems. And still, it acts. This is democracy not as entitlement, but as defiance. In perpetualist terms, it is the orientation toward freedom, even within conditions designed to deny it, where democracy becomes not the condition of the world, but the condition of one's own alignment within the world. The crucial equilibrium. This orientation is not static, it must be sustained against constant erosion. The crucial equilibrium, a core concept in perpetualism, names this dynamic. The continuous adjustment required to maintain principled balance in the face of chaos, coercion, and collapse. Within democratic struggle, the crucial equilibrium is the tension between despair and delusion, between complicity and futility. It resists the easy retreat into cynicism, where nothing matters, and the seductive lie of optimism, where the system will correct itself. It holds the line between resignation and fantasy. It remains present. In this state, democratic practice becomes the art of calibration. One must respond to power without becoming its mirror, critique without collapsing into negation, and resist without demanding immediate victory. The crucial equilibrium demands presence in conditions that reward absence. It asks us to show up politically where there is no guarantee of transformation, because showing up is itself a transformation. Forging democratic meaning. Under tyranny, meaning itself must be forged, not discovered, not remembered, but constructed anew in every act. In a system designed to absorb dissent, dilute solidarity, and exhaust initiative, The act of creating democratic space, even temporary, even fragile, is a reclamation of meaning from the void. This forging does not begin at the ballot box. It begins in the workplace, the neighborhood, the body. It begins wherever people organize for material dignity, refuse silence, and assert their right to shape their reality. These spaces, though often minor in scale, are not merely symbolic. They are training grounds for democratic capacity, sites where power is practiced in microcosm, and where the habits of self-governance are relearned against all odds. Meaning forged under tyranny is not measured by policy wins or media recognition. It is measured by endurance, coherence, and the refusal to internalize the logic of power. These are acts of radical insistence: to speak when silenced, to share when scarcity rules, to organize when fragmentation is normalized. Such acts accumulate, not toward utopia, but toward the reanimation of civic agency. Civic faith under tyranny is not the opposite of realism. It is the highest form of realism, one that sees clearly the conditions of domination, yet refuses to concede to them. It is a realism that resists the metaphysics of defeat, and it is the quiet, stubborn heartbeat of any future democracy. The perpetual struggle, democracy as process, not achievement. Democracy as continuous creation. Democracy is not a destination. It is not something a nation achieves and then possesses. It is not a status that can be declared, certified, or enshrined. Democracy is an act, a process, a struggle, perpetual by nature and by necessity. It must be forged anew with every generation, under every condition, and often against the very systems that claim to represent it. In this sense, democracy is less a structure than a verb. It is not the presence of institutions, but the presence of active self-governance. It is not found in constitutions, but in collective will. It is not the preservation of precedent, but the constant reinvention of the civic body. To forget this is to mistake scaffolding for shelter and form for function. Perpetualism, as a philosophy, sees this clearly. All systems are contingent. All orders are subject to entropy. Therefore, to sustain democracy is not to defend a frozen ideal, but to remain in motion, deliberate, interrogative, adaptive. Democracy fails when it is treated as finished, when it becomes ritualized rather than reconstituted. In every age, it must be created again. Economic democracy as prerequisite. This process, however, cannot proceed on rhetoric alone. The forging of democracy requires tools, material tools. Without economic democracy, political democracy is a sculpture made of mist. Economic democracy means the capacity of people to influence and direct the material structures of their lives, where they live, how they labor, how value is distributed, and what futures are imaginable. Economic democracy does not require equality of outcome. It requires sovereignty of condition. It requires the decommodification of survival, the decentralization of economic control, and the end of extraction without representation. Without these conditions, every political promise remains performative, no matter how inspiring the speech, how diverse the parliament, or how transparent the process. To struggle for democracy while ignoring the economic architecture is to hammer at the branches while watering the root. It is to ask for justice while preserving the machinery of dispossession. It is a contradiction that perpetuates itself in policy cycles, electoral swings, and committee reports that deliver nothing but the illusion of movement. The asymmetry of responsibility. Yet, in this process of democratic forging, not all participants bear equal weight. There is an asymmetry of responsibility that is rarely acknowledged. The oppressed must often labor for democracy under the very structures that deny them its benefits. The marginalized must organize while surviving. The exploited must build while being extracted. This is not fair, it is not just, but it is the historical pattern. Those who most need democracy must often be the ones to create it, and those who most benefit from its absence will rarely assist in its arrival. This asymmetry must be named, and not to resign to it, but to resist the fantasy that democracy can be evenly distributed while power is not. The burden of forging democracy should not fall disproportionately on the shoulders of those already carrying the weight of survival. But history shows that it often does. The enslaved, the colonized, the indebted, the excluded, they have been the true authors of democratic advancement, not through access, but through insistence, not through permission, but through rupture. To practice democracy is to accept struggle, not as a temporary obstacle, but as the condition of possibility. It is to embrace the asymmetry of the task, the fragility of its gains, and the necessity of its reinvention. Democracy is not what we have, it is what we do, perpetually, imperfectly, and often invisibly. Beyond the performance, what democratic capacity actually requires. Economic sovereignty as political foundation. If democracy is to be more than theater, more than procedure, more than the managed illusion of choice, it must be built upon economic sovereignty. Without the material capacity to refuse, to organize, to withdraw, to create alternatives, there is no freedom, only options shaped by necessity. Political choice without economic sovereignty is coerced consent. Economic sovereignty begins where precarity ends. It means housing as a right, not a speculative asset. It means healthcare and education as guarantees, not as leverage. It means labor conditions set by workers, not dictated by global markets or corporate fiat. These are not luxuries, they are the preconditions of political agency. A person worrying about eviction cannot meaningfully participate in a town hall. A parent rationing insulin cannot organize their workplace. A debtor with no exit is a subject, not a citizen. This is not an argument for utopia. It is an argument for baseline dignity. Without it, democracy is reduced to a set of ceremonial gestures, layered over daily subjugation. Economic sovereignty is what gives political speech its teeth. It is what makes organizing possible. It is the floor beneath the democratic project. Without it, the entire structure collapses inward. Structural transformation versus procedural reform. Reform is the language of managed expectations. It tinkers, it corrects. It adjusts the stage lighting without questioning the script. But when the structure itself is designed to concentrate power, reform becomes a palliative. It offers hope, not solution. Democratic capacity cannot be restored through procedural repair alone. Voting rights are meaningless when economic power dictates outcomes regardless of ballot results. Campaign finance reform is hollow when the entire apparatus of media and information remains privatized. Electoral access does not equal political power when survival demands silence. Structural transformation means changing the economic rules that govern life. It means public control over critical infrastructure. It means democratized ownership of production. It means redistributing not just wealth, but the power to determine how wealth is generated and used. These are not fringe positions. They are the logical corollaries of any genuine commitment to democracy. To prioritize procedure over structure is to reinforce the lie that democracy can be fixed within a framework built to exclude. It is to pretend that fairness can be installed into a rigged game. But the rules must be rewritten, not just reinterpreted. Anything less preserves the appearance of democracy while shielding its absence. The Perpetualist Democratic Project. Perpetualism reframes democracy not as a state to be preserved, but as a condition to be perpetually created. It recognizes that structures decay, that gains are reversible, and that institutions calcify without constant reinvention. The perpetualist democratic project does not seek stability through stasis. It seeks movement through integrity. To build democratic capacity within tyrannical structures is not to wait for permission. It is to begin now, wherever one is. In the creation of alternative economies, in mutual aid networks, in worker cooperatives, in community assemblies, in digital communes, in moments of refusal. These are not fragments of resistance. They are seeds of governance. The perpetualist orientation refuses both despair and denial. It neither romanticizes the past nor places its hope in inevitable futures. It acts in the present, imperfectly, incrementally, relentlessly. Democratic capacity is not inherited, it is forged, and that forging must occur within the very systems designed to prevent it. There is no outside from which to begin. There is only the decision to act now, and the discipline to continue acting, even when nothing changes. What democratic capacity actually requires is courage. The courage to name economic tyranny for what it is, to relinquish fantasies of reform without rupture, and to accept that democracy cannot be given. It must be made, remade, and made again. This is not a crisis of civic culture. It is a crisis of political materialism. And the only antidote is struggle with structure, not within the confines of its illusion. The eternal vigilance of economic democracy. Democracy, if it is to mean anything at all, must be wrested back from its current custodians, not those who hold office, but those who hold the means. Its decay is not an accident. It is not the result of apathy, incompetence, or moral decline. It is the direct consequence of allowing politics to drift free from economics, of permitting the machinery of governance to operate within a structure of extraction, and of mistaking the survival of institutions for the survival of participation. The democratic ideal has been reduced to its procedural skeleton. We are told to vote, to protest politely, to donate to campaigns, to believe in checks and balances. Meanwhile, the ground beneath these rituals has been sold, leased, or automated out of reach. The result is not tyranny in spite of democracy. It is tyranny through democracy's hollowed form. Perpetualism demands we name this clearly. It demands we reject the comfort of believing democracy was ever achieved. It was never more than partial, and it is now less than functional. The democratic project, if it ever existed in substance, has always been provisional. And now it is in recession, not because it failed, but because it was never built on a sustainable economic foundation. There is no democracy where ownership is undemocratic. There is no liberty where survival is commodified. The challenge before us is not to restore a golden age that never was, nor to perfect a broken machine, but to reforge the very meaning of democracy itself, not as a form of governance, but as a continuous ethical, material, and collective endeavor. To democratize the economy is not a policy agenda, it is a redefinition of who governs, and by what right. This requires eternal vigilance, not over ballots, but over the structures that determine what ballots can do. It requires that we remain perpetually suspicious of stability that comes without justice, of consensus that comes without redistribution, and of peace that comes without participation. The real labor of democracy is not electoral, it is existential. It is the forging of civic power in conditions of systemic resistance. What we are left with, then, is not a promise, but a practice. A democracy forged in the abyss of economic domination is a democracy worth the name. One that is not given, but made, not preserved, but perpetuated. And that making, that struggle, is not an interruption of democracy, it is democracy. I hope that you not only enjoyed this exploration, but that it stimulated your curiosity. If so,